Welcome to this joint event between the Contemporary China Centre and the Centre for the Study of Democracy. It's a meeting of centres today. And it's really great to be able to welcome Dr. Gerda Wieländer, who many of you will already know from Department of Modern Applied Languages. Gerda's research really intersects both modern languages and also politics and philosophy. So the title of today's talk is, I believe, Politics and the Transcendental. Very cheeky not putting China in the title. So if anyone's expected some sort of transcendental experience, we're going to get it from here today.
Very swiftly.
Obviously, Gerda is known to some of us, but for those who don't know Gerda's research, is that you're looking at the social and political development of contemporary China, and you have looked at a lot at Christian belief and looking at that in a project at the moment, which is a fellowship from the AHRC. So looking forward to hearing about transcendental politics and the politics of the transcendental. So thanks, Gerda.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome everybody. I notice it's quite a mixed audience in terms of disciplines. So it's going to be, I will try to speak to everybody. In the library there will be Chinese stuff that eludes some people, and then maybe something is a bit more politics oriented. Well, I'm sure it will be fine in the end. And then there are some who were not based in Chinese studies or in politics. I hope you still find that interesting. Politics and Transcendental is the topic of my talk today. It's part of, and the talk today is mostly based on one chapter of a book that I've been writing, and I'm glad to say is basically finished now, which is called Christian Values in Contemporary China, which will come out with Routledge later this year. And it's, in a nutshell, the question that I'm asking and hopefully answering in the book is, once religious zeal and headline-grabbing language are stripped away, what really is the social and political impact of Christianity in China today? Now, one has to be aware a bit already of the type of publications and the type of headline-grabbing language and religious zeal that has been employed in the study of Christianity in China, the types of claims that have been made about it, I suppose, to understand why I want to ask this question. But that's essentially what the book as a whole tries to answer. This particular talk today is really the last or the penultimate chapter of the book, and it looks at the nexus between politics and the transcendental as it has emerged or is emerging possibly in the Chinese liberal discourse today. There is an image that has been left quite a big impression in recent years when it happened. It's obviously it's the award ceremony of the Nobel Peace Prize to Liu Xiaobo. Now this is following the publication of a document called Charter 08 on the 10th of December 2008 in China. The document was inspired by the Charter 77 of Czechoslovakia, and it was published on the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. It was initially signed by over 300 individuals from inside and outside the government and across wide sectors of society. Instead of advocating steady reform, the document called for a fundamental change to the political system in China, and it's considered to be the embodiment and synthesis of theoretical and intellectual achievements of Chinese liberal intellectuals over a decade. 1 year after the publication of the Charter 08, Liu Xiaobo, one of the men responsible for drafting the document, was sentenced to an 11-year prison sentence for subversion. And the image of the empty chair placed in his honor at the Nobel Prize award ceremony in Oslo has become a powerful symbol of the entrenched positions as far as the question of human rights and political reform in China are concerned. During an earlier prison sentence in 1999, Liu Xiaobo, who was an active participant in the democracy movement of 1989, read and made extensive notes on Christianity and political action. Revised in 2005, the resulting article, which was called Caesar Tamed by God, Power Subjugated by Faith, is an exposition on the history of Christianity and an analysis of its main social and political characteristics. Two main issues appear to capture Liu's imagination in particular. One is that Christianity made a transition from a persecuted religion to the official religion of the Roman Empire, and that the Christian faith became the transcendental basis for the processes of the rule of law. In this article, Liu's contemplations of the utility or power of Christian faith in political protest leads him to the consideration of peaceful resistance as practiced successfully by Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Liu says peaceful resistance was bound to be futile under dictators like Stalin, Hitler or Mao, but under a totalitarian regime like the Chinese regime today, which pretends to respond to the liberalization and democratization, or what he calls the global tide of liberalization and democratization, by sort of making hypocritical use of the terms freedom, democracy, humanism, and human rights. So he says under such circumstances, the chances of peaceful resistance are greatly improved. For Liu Xiaobo, this kind of hypocrisy, as he calls it, may be the very first step in a development towards a good government. With admiring references to Solzhenitsyn and Václav Havel, Liu concludes with the following thoughts. And that's a quote from the article. Respect for human dignity is the natural source of a sense of justice. If a system or a nation allows its people to live in dignity, then people will identify with the system. To quote Thomas Aquinas, political virtue manifests itself not only in the stability of the system, but also in the establishment of human dignity. If this is not the case, then all kinds of protest movements will ensue, as people's conscience makes it impossible for them to obey. The reason why a liberal system can gradually overcome a dictatorship, why the conclusion of the Cold War is seen as the end of history, lies in the fact that the former recognizes and respects human dignity, whereas the latter not only disregards human dignity, but wipes the floor with it. God says, believe me, the criminal will turn into a just person. Man's natural instinct says, guard your conscience, and a bad government can turn into a good government. So today's talk, I want to address the question as to what is the extent of the influence of Christian thought and faith on Chinese political liberalism today, and what does the Transcendental, as represented in Christian thought, but possibly beyond that, have to do with Chinese politics. The talk is structured according to six categories of liberals as outlined by a scholar called Feng Chunyi. And I've lost my page. No. Sorry. So these categories of liberals are liberal intellectuals, Christian liberal intellectuals. So the scholar makes a distinction between liberal intellectuals and Christian liberal intellectuals, human rights lawyers, liberals within the Chinese Communist Party, grassroots rights activists, and democracy movement activists. So this is sort of a categorization of liberals in China today by an eminent scholar who's been focusing on liberals and liberalism and intellectuals in China in the recent years. So what I'm showing in the talk is structured around, according to these categories, and what I'm trying to show and what I will show is that the distinctions between these categories are blurred today insofar as Christian thinking has had an influence on all these categories, which I want to show today. And I also want to introduce the nascent attempts at formulating a so-called political theology in China, which stipulates the importance of a transcendental source of values in the construction of a polity, as well as in the emergence of a true civil society in China. And then finally, it sort of explores very briefly the likelihood of the emergence of a wider political consensus based on the notion of transcendental values and conscience, in the way that was also already used by Liu Xiaobo. Right, so if you start by talking about Chinese liberals, the concept of peaceful protest, following one's own and appealing to the moral conscience of others, are evident in the wording of the Charter 08. Central to its reasoning is the difference between the existence of laws and the rule of law, and the difference between the existence of a constitution and a true constitutional government. Both issues are central to the writings of all Chinese liberals. While the reformers of the 1980s still mostly approached China's future through the framework of Marxism, liberalism has become the most important political orientation among reform-minded intellectuals in China since the 1990s. Although by far not all who consider themselves liberals agree with the desirability of a multi-party democracy in China. Chinese liberals today not only strive for individual freedoms and seek to replace the Leninist party state with liberal democracy, but they also address the issue of social inequality. In their view, the unfair distribution we see in China today is the direct result of continuing power structures, which dominate the allocation and control of resources through political power and privileges established in the decades before the reform era. Now that lots of debates take place among Chinese liberals as to the exact nature and aim of liberalism. There exists a range of different aims and emphases, which in a multi-party context would manifest itself in different party affiliations, broadly speaking from social democrats to neoliberals. The critiques from the left equate Chinese liberals today with American neoliberals, but most would argue that they differ fundamentally from this group through their concern for social equality. There is, however, no denying that at the very least the Chinese Christian liberals have a very close affinity to American Republicans. There was a great admiration for George Bush on their part, and their allegiance during the most recent American election lay with Mitt Romney. Zhu Xueqin, who is one of China's leading non-Christian liberals, defines liberalism's characteristics as follows. It stands for empiricism in contrast to transcendentalism. It rejects all historical determinism. It requires a representative democracy, the constitutional government, and the legal system as proof against dictatorship. Ethically, it requires the protection of differing values. Zhu Xueqin was one of the 50 most influential public intellectuals on a list that was published now almost 10 years ago in Nanfeng Renwu Zhoukan, a publication in Guangzhou. And he suggests that liberals, while advocating empiricism and endorsing the market system, should also pay close attention to the increasingly pronounced social divisions and conflicts of interests around us. But he believes that only by developing further the weak Chinese market can income disparity and endemic corruption be reduced. So Chinese liberals generally. Now the second category that Feng Chongyi proposes is the category of Christian liberal intellectuals. I've chosen one of the leading Christian liberal intellectuals here. His name is Wang Yi. He also featured on this above-mentioned list of the 50 most influential intellectuals. He's a liberal intellectual and a constitutional theorist, an internet essayist, and also a leading church figure in Chengdu in southwest China. He co-edited together with Yu Jie, who is a writer and now in exile, a Christian cultural magazine called Ganlanzhi, Olive Branch, in which the article that I quoted before by Liu Xiaobo was also published. He is also a regular columnist for a website which is based outside China, which is called Xin Guansha, the New Observer, which is very closely linked to liberalism and particularly to the agenda of the Charter 08. But he's also the pastor of a church which is called the Early Rain Reformed Church in Chengdu, which is one of the biggest unregistered churches in China today, which operates entirely above ground. They've recently, in fact, obtained and bought premises for their congregation, for their church, and they run their own theological seminary, so they're quite well known. Wang Yi regularly writes about constitutionalism from a Christian perspective, and is working towards the development of a political theology. Now, Wang Yi says that the Christian liberals, Chinese Christian liberals that is, consider the political ideals of democracy and freedom and a transcendent moral ethic, they were returning to their religious source, forgotten or ignored by atheist liberals. Theirs, as Wang Yi contends, is an understanding of freedom that is between man as God's creature and God, and thus forms a new development in China's wave of liberalism. So Christian liberals make the belief in Christ the firm basis for the secular value of liberty and equality. They reject the possibility of contracts among people in the absence of a higher transcendental power. The Christian understanding of contracts, and hence the Constitution, lies with God's willingness to restrain his own power in his covenant with Noah. Christian freedom derives from God's self-constraint, he says, and it means the willingness to submit oneself to God's word. Wang Yi distinguishes clearly between secular liberalism, that talks of freedom on the basis of the relation between society and the individual, and Christian liberalism, which talks of freedom as a thing in itself. In 2012, in an issue of the Chinese Religion and Law Monitor, his publication in the US, Wang Yi writes about the possibility of political theology, Christianity and liberalism, where he develops these thoughts further. Among the liberals, Wang increasingly sees the differences between those who understand the transcendental background of liberalism and constitutionalism and firmly believe in it, and those who accept values and freedoms as transcendental values, but who see its source as void or solely dependent on human reason. Wang understands constitutionalism as a kind of self-constraint and self-limitation by those in power. To him, the highest domain of constitutional civilization is covenant. He uses a Chinese word, yue, for that, which includes metaphysical moral constraints as well as specific institutional constraints and textual constraints from tradition. Wang consistently uses the term covenant in his writings, but he accepts that others may want to use a different term to express the same idea. So, for instance, a Chinese term, the Tao, for instance, or principle, yuanzi, he uses in Chinese. So he acknowledges that the thinking about the importance of transcendental values need not be confined to Christianity or a Christian spiritual context. So he signals a very cautious willingness to work together on the formation of a political theology that draws on a wider basis than Christianity. Wang argues that all who rely on a transcendental source of values, regardless of their source, lean towards moral constraint. In fact, behind political philosophy and political commonwealth, there always exists a dimension of political theology in his view. When I asked him whether he envisaged working with other non-Christian liberals who also speak of transcendental values in order to develop further his preliminary thoughts on a political theology, he had to concede that there was very little direct contact between them, between the Christian liberals and other liberals, and also very few opportunities for them to meet one another. But there are apparently currently plans for such a meeting in this summer in Oxford, where the 6th China Theological Symposium will be held, which meets every year, and they are planning to bring together representatives from the New Left, the New Confucians, and liberals to hold face-to-face discussions on this matter. So we'll see what will come out of it, if anything. But for the moment, Wang Yi's formulation stays firmly within a Christian context. He says, the pursuit of a constitutional polity and the acceptance of and submission to transcendental values is a simultaneous process. From the Christian perspective, if that is not happening simultaneously, then constitutionalism is simply the Tower of Babel and is doomed to fail. I just want to show as an interjection the screenshot of Guangzhou. It's a website which, or rather a publication which is now web-based, but there used to be a publication, or the key liberal publication, pre-1949, was a publication called Guangzhou, the Observer, which ceased to exist after 1949. And there is a tradition that in the 1980s, liberal-minded intellectuals sort of not reinvigorated that publication, but founded a new publication of the same name to sort of establish this tradition, or place themselves in this tradition. And that one folded in 1989, and it was subsequently revived again as a website called Guangzhou in 2002. which carried on the liberal tradition of the predecessors with very close involvement by Harry Wu, for example, who was very famous for writing his memoirs of time spent in the Chinese gulag. I don't know in how far he's known outside circles of Chinese studies. And it was once again refashioned in 2012 as an independent overseas website focusing on research and criticism. That's its own mission statement. And it has a very clear political agenda which is linked very closely to the clauses of the Charter 08. What's interesting about this website is that it lists 4 main editors, and I wasn't able to find out information about one of them, but all the other 3 are all devout Christians. So it's quite an interesting development. There's Harry Wu, and then there is Zhang Dajun, and also Yu Jie, who's a writer who went into exile just in January, well, about a year ago. Okay, so we're moving on to a view of, so Liu Jinning and He Guanghu are both liberal intellectuals that are not considered to be Christian liberals. We've just heard of Wang Yi's political theology and Christian concepts. Now, Wang Yi's conception of a constitutional government which stipulates the firm belief in a Christian God will not be very easily accessible to necessarily many other people. But it nonetheless seems to find an audience among other liberal intellectuals. For example, Liu Jinning writes in 2010, he's firmly placed in the non-Christian camp, that the value source of all constitutions is the transcendental value of religion. He calls a constitution without holy support just like a decree from Caesar. Liu Jinning considers the freedom of religion the most important freedom of all, from which all others follow, because freedom of religion guarantees freedom of the soul, without which no subject can develop a conscience. But the freedom to follow one's conscience instead of authority is the key to human dignity. So words that are very similar to what Liu Xiaobo was saying. So freedom of religion is starting to be seen in wider liberal circles as a pivotal for all other rights, but in particular for the right to peaceful resistance and political change. The importance of transcendental values is also invoked in the context of civil society and a true citizen spirit. He Guanghu, who is an academic at Renmin University and also a signatory of Charter 08, does not speak of a political theology, but he makes a very clear link between the establishment of a citizen society. I mean, that's 公民社会 in the Chinese, but I translated as citizen society because he speaks of individual citizens that have to have certain qualities rather than of a society. So he says he makes a clear link between the establishment of this, the citizen society, and the transcendental spirit. He argues that the key question to resolving China's mounting problems lies with politics, and that the only answer is, including answers to its social development, lies in the establishment of democracy and the rule of law. He defines the latter as the control by law of all members of society without exception. Democracy, in turn, is the opportunity for every member in society to be involved in the establishment of the rule of law and in the management of society. Only those who take part in the process of establishing the rule of law can truly be called citizens, in his view. So he emphasizes the importance of people's awareness of the links between them and society, and in turn the links between social management and politics. People have to start to think like citizens and consider the benefits of society beyond their own personal benefits. In order to be able to do so, their thinking and actions need to be guided by a transcendental spirit that enables them to transcend their own selves. To him, the most developed transcendental spirit is religious faith that transcends this world. Because only in the face of a true object of faith can the person realize his own smallness, temporality, and limitations, and can transcend his or her own self. He concedes that terms like God or spirit are difficult to accept for some people, but the term transcendent is more widely considered to be an interesting concept by liberals, as it can help overcome what he calls the prevalent pragmatism in Chinese society, And at the very most basic level, it can just mean the ability to step outside oneself and to see the bigger picture, and to overcome differences among each other. So imbued with this transcendental spirit, citizens will not only obey the law, but they will also keep a very critical eye on society as a matter of conscience. Aware of the superior nature of God's law, these citizens will be aware of the relative nature of man's law, and will therefore constantly apply themselves to the improvement of society and the true establishment of the rule of law. So in very classical Chinese rhetoric style, He Guanghu concludes that the basis and the aim of political reform is the establishment of a society of citizens. The prerequisite and the result of a society of citizens is a raised citizen awareness. And the raising of citizen awareness and the rising of people's will in turn requires the reawakening of a transcendental spirit as part of our moral qualities. So for He Guanghu, Wang Yi, and other liberals, and Christian liberals included, politics is not defined by the political dictator, nor is it confined to the field of political power. It's understood as a public life in Havel's sense of anti-political politics that advocates the reintroduction of ethical and moral norms as the guiding principles of behavior. Okay, so we're moving on to the next category, which is rights defense. Or Weiqian is the Chinese term that has established itself over the last 10 years or so for human rights lawyers or just rights defense. Since the beginning of the reform era, which is about 1980 now, so it's over 30 years, lawyers are probably the fastest growing profession, or certainly legal profession of all. There was barely a single lawyer in China in 1978, and today there are about 140,000 registered lawyers that all have, well, the majority of them have a law degree and they're registered with the Chinese bar. And lawyers of all ilk, whether corporate, criminal, or private, are in very high demand as a profession. But at the same time, it's also one of the most difficult and most frustrating professions in China, which results in the fact that lawyers are probably the most politicized sector of Chinese society today. According to a survey which was conducted among 1,500 Chinese lawyers in all provinces across the country, they value political rights far more than economic rights, and they were least happy with the extent to which their aspirations for democracy were realized. More than half of these lawyers, so more than half of those surveyed, are self-identified as being Weiqian lawyers or rights protection lawyers, which is quite interesting because it's usually this particular movement or this term is only associated with a relatively small number of lawyers in China. This term, this concept of these people, the Weiqian lawyers, started to appear at about the start of the new millennium in China. They by and large accepted the legitimacy of the political system, but used the existing legal framework to protect the rights of citizens within these constraints. Researchers have identified a spectrum along which Weiqian lawyers operate, ranging from being moderate to being critical to some being radical lawyers. Different individuals move along this spectrum in the course of their career, and they tend to become radicalized the longer they engage in the profession and the more frustrations they have experienced in the dealings with state institutions. Some of the most radical lawyers today, who have since suffered severe harassment and imprisonment, including the still missing Gao Zhisheng, they have started out as poster boys for China's officially promoted rule of law. So it's there's a movement, a development that has taken place. So these Weiqian lawyers seek to vindicate individual rights promised by many of China's laws, and unlike their colleagues in corporate law, they are motivated by a sense of justice rather than the promise of a profit. The fact that many of the most radicalized Weiqian lawyers are Christians isn't really touched upon in the growing literature on them. Still, there's a very close relationship and a growing synergy between law and religion and Weiqian lawyers on the one hand and church leaders. which has led to particularly active Weiqian community surrounding the issue of religion and religious freedom in China. This small community is centered around what was called the Association of Human Rights Attorneys for Chinese Christians, which consisted of individuals who were eminent figures within the academic fields, constitutional law for example, but who also were devoted Christians with their own church congregations. And Wang Yi, who I mentioned previously, was one of them. And he used to be an academic. He was part of the Weiqian movement, but Gao Zhisheng, for instance, was also belonged to them. Now, today, the Weiqian movement is much larger and goes beyond Christian circles. Law in particular, and Weiqian lawyering even more so, is a very challenging experience. Many young lawyers leave the bar in the first few years after qualifying because the work is so difficult and so frustrating. Among other problems, the clients often don't pay in China, so that doesn't make things easier. Now, researchers argue that the importance Chinese lawyers place on political rights and their dissatisfaction with the level of democracy in China is a direct result of their occupational vulnerability. They back this up by the finding that lawyers who identified themselves as Weiqian did not display any different political values as the rest. Generally speaking, support for political reform increases when people have had negative direct experience with state actors. The connection between Weiqian lawyering and Christianity is multifaceted and very complex. Clearly, some of the individuals who are associated with Weiqian lawyering were already Christians when they started to get involved in this kind of work. More have converted to Christianity at a later stage, so only after starting as lawyers they then also converted to Christianity. And certainly, when I first spoke to people, in this circle in 2006, there were very great doubts and misgivings among the group of self-declared true Christians as to whether Gao Zhisheng, for instance, or Guo Feixiong, who are now always referred to as Christian Weiqian lawyers, could really be considered Christians. The professional vulnerability of Weiqian lawyers may be a result of their willingness to accept cases that expose them to this kind of vulnerability as a result of the pre-existing values. So they may already, they may have a strong sense of justice and therefore be more inclined to take on these cases. But at the same time, the vulnerability that they experience also makes them more open to the spiritual and intellectual support offered by Christian colleagues. The majority of Weiqian lawyers, for instance, operate out of Beijing, which is sort of a concentration of resources and networks. There's often also means that you can draw on financial support that is often provided from overseas. Some of these lawyers also claim that they have converted to Christianity because they realize that the rule of law and democracy in China lack the necessary deep foundation of faith and morality. And so they are thus becoming involved with Christian liberal discussions on constitutional government and the necessity for transcendental values as outlined above. Right. So let's move on to the next category. The next category was liberals within the party. In his musings on the historical success of peaceful protests, as Liu Xiaobo did in the article I quoted at the beginning, he conceded that the success of people like Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was facilitated by a broadly shared value system between the protester and those and the government against whom they protested, as far as the notions of justice, for instance, were concerned, which led to a degree of shame and insight on the part of the government in the face of the peaceful protests. There's a British sociologist called Steve Bruce who also says that protest movements are more successful if the protesters share the same value system as those against whom they protest. So this could lead one to conclude that a Christian-led protest movement, or at least one that is perceived to be imbued with Christian values, is unlikely to succeed in China at this present stage. It's also one reason, though, why the uptake of Christian values in the official discourse, as well as the conversion to Christianity in communist circles, is of particular interest. Certainly the binary thinking regarding party membership and religious faith is no longer appropriate. There is the most famous, the most prominent party member and Christian is the economist Zhao Xiao, who moves in circles which are frequented by other Christian academics, but is also actively involved in missionary outreach work, for instance. He blogs prolifically and has over 7 million followers on China's equivalent of Twitter. Despite being a leading economist and government advisor, Zhao Xiao has become most famous for a short essay which was published in 2002, in which he exhorts the importance of churches in the market economy. Writing after a few months' sojourn in the United States, Zhao concluded that the secret of America's economic power was its churches. The physical presence of church buildings was a clear symbol for Zhao that a legal framework and punishment alone were not enough to encourage ethical behavior in the market. In his view, the collusion between government and business, the amassing of wealth for personal gain only, and the dishonesty prevalent in the Chinese market economy were all the result of a lack of belief in any force outside the human realm which guided human trust and agreements. Nearly 10 years after this essay, so very recently, Zhao considers the possibility of a social crisis that may lead to a political crisis as the most pressing issue in China. Following 30 years of reform, people's economic needs have been largely fulfilled, he says, and have moved on to a social and political as well as a religious level. He warns that government reform is so far ill-prepared for these demands, which comes at a price. Zhao Xiao argues, he's an economist after all, that budget expenditure in China towards maintaining stability now surpasses expenditure for national defense, meaning that China is holding on to stability quite literally at all cost. This may not be sustainable if the challenge rises, as it is likely to, as he says. So he presents an economic argument for social and political change, which in his words will be a change of the cross. Zhao sees China's industrialization and urbanization as a huge opportunity for China's evangelization and harbors a vision of 30-30. That means that by 2030, more than 30% of the Chinese population will be Christian. That's a vision that he shares with David Aikman, who published a very a book that made huge waves in 2003, which also had a similar assumption that by 2030 there would be about 30% of the Chinese population that would be Christian. The majority of these new converts, or the majority of these 30% of Christians, are envisaged to come from China's urban middle classes. Although Zhao Xiao meets with outright hostility from Chinese Christians abroad, who go so far as comparing him and those who follow him to the Nazis' Volkskirche, he is quite readily accepted as a Christian inside China by other Christians, and his party membership is not considered to be a huge problem. In this context, it's also very worth noting that many of the individuals who play a very leading role in the theological direction and publications and what I would call ideological leadership of churches today were themselves party members before they converted to Christianity. That may have happened outside China, or it may have happened in China. And even if they are no longer party members or they are outside China now, they retain very close contacts, at the very least at a private level, with party members inside China. So the notion that Christians and Communist Party members don't talk to each other, or that there is no overlap between these two constituents, is certainly not the case. Most recently, we're still with liberals within the party. Most recently, the possibility of a social crisis and the worry about China's future also informed another petition, which was signed by 71 academics and lawyers from within the system, which is usually the expression used for party members. That was in December 2012. And they were prompted to this action by sort of their worry about the Arab Spring-style social uprising in China and what needed to be done to preempt that. They're asking for the implementation of the country's constitution, which guarantees the freedom of speech, assembly, publication, and religion, and so forth. And it stops well short of the demands of the Charter of Eight, but it needs to be said that this emphasis on the Chinese constitution and its proper implementation was pioneered by Christian liberals and the Weijian lawyers before, and now seems to be much more openly and widely accepted and also articulated by liberals that have nothing to do with Chinese Christians. Right, now the next penultimate category is China's middle class. In the scholar on whose work I based this categorization lists certain individuals under the category of grassroots activists. That's really his categorization. And he speaks of individuals like Chen Guangcheng and Guo Feixiong as liberal grassroots activists which are distinct from other groups of liberals. Now I sort of slightly take a slightly different approach to it, because one person he mentions, Guo Feixiong, is actually a lawyer. He's a relatively well-known Christian human rights lawyer, and therefore in my view needs to go in that category if we're staying with categories. And Chen Guangcheng, on the other hand, he's the blind lawyer and activist against human rights violations in the government's enforcement of the one-child policy, who's received considerable support from Chinese Christian groups in the US, who tried to present his actions in the view of from a pro-life perspective, quite wrongly. But Chen Guangcheng himself is not a Christian, but they're very well-known names, these two, in the myriads of grassroots Protestant activisms in which China's middle class play an increasingly important role. So therefore, rather than focusing on individuals, I want to talk here in this section about the grassroots or if you want to call it a nascent political liberalism of an increasingly vocal sector of Chinese society. Now, a team at CAS found that China's middle class is more critical of the current social and political situation and less confident in government performance than any other strata of society. They also suggest that middle class consciousness or middle class values sometimes differ from mainstream consciousness. They often express above average doubt about official ideology and the present power structure. In recent years, middle class grievances against government policy have become more evident, and there's even concern that the middle class may become angry. In authoritarian regimes, the nascent middle class may originally rely on the political system, but as members of the middle class become more autonomous, they also become more critical and maybe even challenge the political order. In this context, values become of particular importance. As said before, Chinese liberals see the root cause of China's social inequality in the ongoing dominance of pre-reform power structures that impact negatively on distribution in society. Now, the social representation of these power structures may lie in what is now referred to as a black-collar class. That is, urbanites who dress in black, drive around in black cars, have hidden incomes, and links to the mafia and to state-owned enterprises. They are increasingly seen to be the true beneficiaries of reform by the sort of white-collar classes, and as the real political ally of the Chinese government. Members of China's middle class already have a higher rate of participation in elections and rights protection activities than other groups, and there's an expectation that middle class political participation will become an important factor in community governments, not least because of the high involvement of this sector of society in China's NGOs. Middle classes are making their voices heard. While in cases of corruption, people may think, I might have done the same, the public's reaction to the scandals involving contaminated food, drinking water, and hazardous substances has been less understanding. Large-scale environmental protests, for instance, have been taking place in China's big cities in recent years, fueled by anxieties and safety concerns of urban residents. 30 years of reform have not only created more wealth, but have also led to a harrowing catalogue of environmental problems and other often man-made disasters. whose root cause is increasingly seen to lie with institutional structures and those in power. During the Mao years, vague feelings of unhappiness over these power structures were prevented from becoming fully conscious, and the potential for widespread social discontent was kept in check largely by stringent morality, in which collectivism demanded the subordination of the individual voice to society, and altruism called for the sacrifice of the self for the sake of others. Now, these moral parameters no longer bind Chinese individuals in the same way, but the declining influence of collective values does not mean that collective action has disappeared, as the myriads of incidents of collective protest testify. These protests are not just about protecting individual interests, which in the case of environmental protests are also collective interests, but also about an increasing awareness, especially among the young, of global values, and that China must engage in these global values. Now, apart from the participation in protest action during acute crisis points, individuals also start to challenge and resist an ethos defined wanting, or something that they say is not right, by taking a calculated risk. This risk may be easy to take when supported by a strong moral conviction like faith. This is just a very small example. One young and recently converted Catholic music student in Chengdu told me that initially he said that his faith was only expressed in Sunday worship, and it didn't really have any influence on how he acted during the week or how he interacted with society. But then he did say that since his conversion, he had become even more resentful of the indoctrination sessions that take place on campus. So all students have to take political classes, and they have to take these classes in order to be able to graduate. So he can't really absent. That's what I mean by taking a calculated risk. So if he absents himself entirely from these classes, then he risks not being able to graduate at all. So he still goes to these classes, but his personal act of defiance is to no longer attend the collective singing sessions of revolutionary songs, which also form part of the political education. The fact that the school authorities reduced his yearly allowance from 3,000 yuan to 1,000 yuan after they learned of his conversion surely hasn't warmed up his vocal cords anymore. But so he doesn't go. He's just no longer joins in the singing. And why? So initially the faith doesn't initially manifest itself as a form of political criticism, or does not articulate it as such, but it can become an experience of moral resistance. And so conversion to a religion or to Christianity, obviously that's what I'm focusing on, does not take place as a conscious political act, but the new identity that emerges from it informs a new self-awareness and a confidence when dealing with the world around them. When individuals feel vulnerable, they also tend to seek protection from social institutions. However, due to a lack of social trust and underdeveloped rule of law, a lack of transparency and controlled media, social institutions in China cannot fulfill this function. Indeed, they are often the main objects of distrust. In this sense, the moral crisis in China is also a political crisis. Political changes are necessary in order to put in place preconditions for social trust and functioning institutions. Now, the big question remains as to what moral system should function as the basis for moral and institutional reconstruction. Now, we've seen in the example of the lawyers that there exists a correlation between professional vulnerability and heightened political awareness. Now, we could argue that the more dissatisfaction and frustration and the more vulnerable China's white-collar middle-class individuals feel in interaction with state actors and in the face of the so-called disprivileged black-collar class, the more likely it becomes that they're already higher than average political participation may become radicalized. It's also likely that they too will be receptive to the comprehensive evangelization endeavors of urban churches. In fact, they already are, because the highest growth in Chinese Christians is seen in urban middle classes. It's definitely urban Christianity that has been growing the fastest. More immediately, of course, churches can offer spiritual haven and comfort from life's injustice and vicissitudes. Finally, and this is only very briefly, a look at, just for the sake of completeness, also at democracy movement activists, by which Feng Zhongying means 1989 activists, which he identifies as a separate category yet again of liberals in China. Now Liu Xiaobo is a veteran of 1989, as I said at the start. And while he himself is not a Christian, he's considered to be the Chinese political dissident with the closest affinity to Christian thinking. Now, since Liu Xiaobo has been arrested, his most recent arrest, and since Yu Jie's move into exile, who is very prolific, they're all very prolific writers, Yu Jie has written a book about Liu Xiaobo as part of a campaign to disseminate Liu Xiaobo's thinking more widely. It creates a sense, for the outside observer, it creates a sense that Liu Xiaobo is being claimed by Christian liberals. In a similar way as someone as Yang Xiaokai, who was active during the Cultural Revolution, who converted to Christianity decades later, is also being claimed by Christian liberals. Support for Liu Xiaobo is now starting to be voiced more widely, and certainly not confined to Christian liberals. But 1989 is quite an important factor also in the conversion to Christianity by a great number of leading figures in the Chinese mission today. They either went into exile as a result of 1989. Some moved to outside or into the US as part of graduate studies in the early 1990s. But 1989 is sort of seen as a key experience, a key date in their conversion. I mean, seen as they declare it to be. So it's based on their own testimonies, which are sort of standard. Who interview Christians, they will always start every conversation with the story of how they converted. And so 1989 features very prominently in many of these stories. But it's also quite important still in the sort of, want to call it the collective unconscious of a generation, a sort of the 40-plus generation, who identify the crackdown on students as a key moment in their lives when their youthful idealism, which was at the time still very much associated with the party, was shattered, and they turned to look for something else. And they seem to have found a new idealism in their faith. So 1989 still resonates in the minds of ordinary people, including Christians, and continues to feed a sense of injustice and distrust of the authorities. So finally, this is just a last slide. We've heard about these notions of covenant and their political theology, and although these notions, especially the one of the covenant, is firmly rooted within Christian thinking, the concept does resonate with Chinese cultural concepts like the Tao or Tian, heaven, as a code of belief centered on a source of morality outside the human realm. But one can also find notions similar to the Christian notion of conscience in the Chinese rural moral discourse. Ellen Oxfeld speaks of the importance of liangxin. So liangxin and liangzhi, they are both used, they're both translated as conscience in English. I asked someone, a Chinese philologist, what the difference was between them, and he said there wasn't really any difference, but he thought that liangxin was more sensitive to Chinese cultural traditions, whereas liangzhi was more of a Western term. In any case, in China's in the village that Ellen Oxfeld researched, she found that liangxin was a very, very important concept in the moral discourse of the villages. A person lacks liangxin if he or she violates their moral obligations, even if they're troubled by this later. So it's not enough to be troubled by it later on. So you have to meet your moral obligations. So for Oxford, liangxin is different to the English conscience, as it not only implies an inner voice, but also the actions it should prompt. Now, in my view, Oxford here makes an error of reducing the English conscience to the meaning of a troubled conscience, which is a rather narrow and restricted understanding of it. Certainly, the Judeo-Christian understanding of conscience includes the importance of corresponding acts. So the main difference, as I can make out based on this study, is that whether one's action in the village were considered to be of conscience or liangxin, depended on relative moral obligations of one individual towards another, based on a shared history, whereas the Christian conscience is guided by absolute moral guidelines known to all who share the faith. So as Oxford says, in Moonshadow Pond, which was the village which she researched, a commonly quoted aphorism made reference to the connection between memory and morality. For instance, when you drink water, remember the source, refers to the necessity of remembering who is responsible for assistance you may have received. Now for Christians, the ultimate source is always God. One's moral obligations are not towards another human being, but one's actions need to pass muster in the eyes of a higher force. In the absence of a shared history and closely knit moral community, shared moral frameworks which lay out what is right and what is wrong become of increasing importance for China's increasingly urbanized society, where social relations need to be built among strangers. Christianity is a strong contender for providing such a moral framework. In a political sense, the notion of conscience expressed as liangxin or liangzhi in Chinese resonates with China's cultural sensibilities, but has gained significance in guiding one's actions in the context of resistance against what is seen as not right. So in conclusion, to say perhaps that before we can do questions, is that Christian values have an influence on all categories of liberals as identified by Feng Chongyi. They all somehow see certain value or have started to incorporate concepts that were originally proposed by Christian liberals and also Christian lawyers. But there's a very complex relationship between churches and which in lawyering, for instance, and also between Christian belief and political action, which I haven't really had time to go into today, but I'm very happy to answer questions to that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that Christian belief is a prerequisite or indeed inevitably leads to political action or political resistance. In fact, it's the vulnerability, the frustration, and the ensuing value system that is then adopted by people who experience all these frustrations in the face of the state institutions, which will become key. And the examples that are set by those who are guided by their conscience. And they seem to be, at least sort of in a period of political transition, and those who seem to be prepared to make the biggest sacrifices appear to very often draw on very strong moral convictions and a faith. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, good. About 35 minutes for questions, and I'm sure with our two communities present here today, there'll be lots of questions. So, any questions for Gerda or comments? If you say your name and that's where you're from first, yes?
Hi, Yan Yuan. I'm from Westminster, PhD graduate. I guess one of the main issues for Christian liberals to address in their movement is to differentiate themselves, is to apply Christianity values to the context of Chinese society, which is always the case throughout the Chinese revolutionary history. So I'm wondering, how conscious have those activists or liberals have been in differentiating themselves from the Western Christian liberals or Christian movements?
There isn't a really very distinct differentiation going on by those who are most. Wang Yi, for instance, who is a very, very example that I brought, Wang Yi, and also someone like Yu Jie, who are very political. They are very much in line with Western Christianity and Western political systems. They don't really attempt to differentiate in the sense that I mean, do you mean is it a Chinese Christianity that they're trying to formulate in response to Chinese?
Make Christianity more Chinese.
Make Christianity more Chinese. That depends. There are very different views out there, which is one of the points where it becomes a lot more. It becomes very difficult to draw generalizations from Christian faith. Some people, some individuals, are very pro American, pro-Western, pro-American liberal democracy, with a complete sort of very influenced by evangelical networks in the US and in Southeast Asia. So that's really a very important connection. And these contacts in the US and in Southeast Asia are very often Chinese. Actually, they're not white Americans, but they're Chinese. They're either Chinese exiles or they're Chinese who moved to the States as graduate students, as adults. So there is an they have particular theological orientation as well. So I mean, there's a whole can of worms regarding theology when you talk about Chinese Christianity, because it's historically hugely divided in terms of theological orientation, and that continues today. So the interpretation or the understanding of what does it mean to be a Christian, there is not very little agreement on that. Part of the biggest the main reason why there's such resentment of the official church, for instance, in China, is theological. Is that what the official Protestant church, for instance, presents as the vocation or as the definition of a Christian is rejected by Christian liberal intellectuals, for instance. So it's theologically, so you have to start talking about theology when you start talking about in what way does it then become a Chinese Christianity? It would seem that what is generally referred to as a so-called New Calvinist theology is very, very attractive and guides these most politically active Christian intellectuals, who also have their own churches, therefore sort of also become very political on a daily basis by having their own churches, operating them above ground, purchasing their own premises. I mean, all of this is pushing the envelope on a daily basis. So this sort of New Calvinist theology is very comparatively rational, as opposed to what is generally referred to as very spiritual Chinese Christian traditions, as you find them in the rural areas. It's very male-dominated. It's very, very conservative in its gender relations, for instance. It's entirely focused on Christianity as a religion. It has very little interest and tolerance for other religions. It's in many ways very similar, which is, as I argue, in different, I suppose, ultimately in my book, not dissimilar from the party state in some of its aims and the way it goes about it, and in some of its agenda. So there's difficult to detect in these particular politically engaged and individuals an attempt to make Christianity very Chinese. But at the same time, the fact that so much of this evangelical movement in the States and also in Southeast Asia is now, that there are very many Chinese who are part of it, who actually grew up in China. So they sort of grew up in both in a socialist Chinese tradition as well as culturally Chinese. And that is part of their identity as much as their newly found Christianity. So I suppose ultimately the question may actually not be in what way they sort of adapt, or Chinese culture adapt, so they adapt to Chinese culture, but how this Christianity, which they are also, they're also involved in the mission, in the international Christian mission in quite a big way. So the more interesting question is maybe in how Christianity is being shaped by these values, by Chinese cultural values. It's not. It's very difficult, really, to draw a line around China and say there is a Chinese Christianity in China, and then there is a different type of Christianity somewhere else. There are lots and lots of. There's a lot of conversations, a lot of dialogue, a lot of mutual influence there. But in terms of, I mean, I don't know if you want to argue, if one can argue that, for instance, the very conservative view on gender relations, for instance, and the male dominance, whether does it come forth more easily in a Chinese cultural context? I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure, but you know, is that a sign of Chinese patriarchy having an influence on Chinese Christianity, or is that a generally conservative worldview? And this what's referred to as complementarian gender relations, so that men and women are considered to be equal but different. So they are of equal value overall, but hold very different, fulfill very different functions in the family, in church, and in wider society. I mean, all of this is very. It's quite interesting to see how readily it is also accepted by many women and educated women, but at the same time it's also one reason why a lot of people leave these churches. And they say, oh, maybe not. But it's definitely a dialogue, and it's difficult to say. There's sort of a mutual adaptation of faith and culture.
You seem to have mapped out this talk in terms of liberalism. I mean, do you think that there's another mapping required, which is the theological mapping in terms of, you know, I think you were hinting at that, but the question that I was thinking throughout that was about things like liberation theology and different different traditions within, you know, within political theology, because there's quite different texture and composition to those.
Hugely different. I mean, the talk is laid out, or is around liberalism, because that appears to be the most influential sort of intellectual political thought in China today, within China. But if you talk about Christianity, there is theology becomes also immediately political, because there's a different. It depends on how far back you want to go now in the answer, but. Put very simply, that the official Protestant theology is considered to be a more liberal theology, though that has nothing to do with politics of liberalism now, but liberal theology, and where the Bible is considered a historical text that has parts of which are of relevance, parts of which do not need to be, they're interpreted like any other text. The Bible isn't seen as any other text. Where, for instance, for these individuals that I'm talking about here, the Bible is seen as 100% God's word, an infallible source of truth. So already, it's just simply the approach to the Bible creates a huge gulf between what the official Protestant theology says and what what they refer to themselves as true Christians say. So that's already a huge difference. Now, official theology, for instance, stresses the importance of social work. So one of the aims is to get the Christian population active in, so tap into this growing Christian population in China as a positive social force. By making it, engaging in social work and charity and so forth. So on the assumption and calling on, that all Christians are called to do God's work and emulate Jesus' life, and the idea of the social gospel that that is the duty of a Christian, to help others. And now that is not subscribed to by the majority of Christians in China, though. Again, partly because. For the simple reason, because it's the official theology and is sort of seen as a reduction of the faith to a set of social ethics that can be employed neatly in the interest of the party state. but also because for the majority of Christians, Chinese Christians, it tended to be individual salvation that is more important than engaging with society. So there's a whole spectrum among the Christian groups in China, which are themselves a result of highly diverse and eclectic missionary endeavors in China in the first half of the 20th century, where often it was literally individuals who took themselves off to China with, just equipped with an enormous amount of enthusiasm and religious zeal, and just went to live there for a few decades and created their own sort of little enclaves. And today there is there's a huge variety, and sort of what as far as the engagement with society is concerned, you get a whole spectrum of not wanting to be engaged in society at all, have nothing to do with it. It's all doesn't don't want to even talk about it. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's the political engagement where churches become, or by Christian critics, from within China, who say, well, some of these individuals, they just come and hijack the churches and make them their political platform, when actually we want nothing to do with that.
Yeah. Graham wants to jump in.
Yeah, I don't want to jump in just to something you said, and then there's something else. You just, if I misunderstood, I might have misunderstood what you said, but you were saying that some of the significant number of the Christians that you're talking about have a very literalist reading of the Bible. Is there liberalism therefore a deep liberalism, or is it a strategic liberalism such that they are looking for the opportunity to proselytise more ambitiously? So there's a question for me about whether you really can put these people together, because some of them may well be just looking for a political regime in which they can be more active as Christians rather than being committed to liberalism per se. So they'd be happy if it was a dominant Christian religion and therefore not worried about liberalism. The second thing I wondered about your use of the term transcendental. I haven't really thought this through, but you seem to be using it a bit willy-nilly, of sort of people who appeal very strongly to, have got a politics and a faith based in very strong religious values, to people who thought beyond self-interest. Now, to me, that's rather a large zone of activity there, and it includes a hell of a lot of people. So I'd like you to be a little bit more specific about, because if you are talking here, which I think you have an interest in, can we see collaborations, potential directions of change, etc. That's a very tenuous connection when you're talking about it in such an extent.
So the first...
they are connected, I think, because if it is the case that these people are not so bothered, are really not secondary liberals, whether or not this will hold together, this coalition.
Well, first of all, the question about the liberalism, well, it depends on... again, on who you talk to or who you read. There are certainly those who see and who state that, and certainly Wang Yi is actually one of them, who would say that the creation of a constitutional democracy is not the aim per se, but it's the political system that least hinders the spread of the gospel. Yeah, okay. But then there are others who say, well, not so sure. So the idea is that it's really all about the second coming of Christ rather than establishing a liberal democracy. Now, there are two answers to that. One is that there are others who say they doubt actually how devoutly Christian they really are, whether it isn't much more political than they say it is. And the second, what I would say is that we are because we're obviously talking about a possible period of political transition. We're not talking about a coalition is not a word I would use. Words, yeah, sorry, but it's a political transition where I would say, well, does that matter if certain individuals see democracy as a way to proselytize? It doesn't really matter for everybody else. If that is conducive to a certain direction in which things are going, then that these are voices among other voices that, once the transition, if it takes place, that will sort itself out, I would have thought, in terms of political parties and so forth. in terms of transcendental, yes, I agree absolutely. I mean, it's really a translation of a Chinese term that is being used, which is 超越, but which sort of is always translated as transcendental. It implies something. It can imply it denotes the range of what you pointed out. It can be just fairly pragmatic, a sense of, okay, you just step outside yourself, see the bigger picture and say, okay, well, just leave my own interest behind and see a wider sort of needs of society. But it's a sort of, it's a range, in fact. They're not points and they're not mutually exclusive. You know, you can go all the way to, you know, to the notion of something that is transcendental, which is outside the human realm. Now, for most liberals and for the groups that I've introduced today, maybe not so much the middle classes. I mean, that's much more problematic, as you know, in terms of the sheer number of people that denotes. But among liberals and Christian liberals and lawyers, it's the understanding that it's just something very pragmatic, or rather, or not pragmatic, but sort of, you know, just lifting a little bit above one's own individual position to see the bigger picture is the most basic understanding. But most of them do focus or emphasize there needs to be something that everybody relates to as a sort of moral benchmark, and that probably needs to be something outside the human realm. That's what seems to emerge as a sort of tentative agreement. Now, what that is, though, there's no agreement necessarily over. So there are also Confucians who are starting to talk about, which is generally really seen as a very rational, this worldly system of ethics, not a religion. But even Confucians are starting to reposition Confucianism as something that has a very strong transcendental element, i.e. something that's not human, something that's outside the human realm, that's some sort of source of value, some sort of morality and the value lying in it not being human, and the implication, because it's not human, it's outside the human realm, it's absolute and relevant to all. So, but again, in terms of it's a word. I mean, if you want, it starts with a word that is being used, that different people may project different meanings onto, which nonetheless can be some sort of a recognition, perhaps, when different people start talking about different things. A certain recognition of similarity can evolve from that. So I don't foresee a political coalition arising from that, but there's a certain consensus, perhaps, that there are, you know, that this is a vague direction.
A question from Rob and then Ricardo.
The question I ask is, I keep wondering is this not really a critique of Confucianism? That what's happening is this Communist Party, Confucianism go together. The development, same in Japan, it's often Christians, intellectuals, who question the Japanese regime in the imperialist period and post-imperialist period. I'm just wondering, maybe it's actually seen an inadequacy of Confucianism, which Christianity is taking that space of.
Well, that's certainly what the Christians argue, that it is the inadequate. But in fact, it's, yes, I mean, a lot of Marxists, in fact, also, and Confucians, all within China, say that Confucianism doesn't provide enough. It doesn't provide that kind of absolute moral standards and that kind of all-encompassing moral system in the way Christianity does.
And the second question, is it Kant we're missing here? With the Chinese Kant. It's not Christianity, it's not St. Augustine, the inner balance. It's Kant, Immanuel Kant, who's missing in China.
Well,
If only they translate the first and second critique, that'd be fine.
it's
Or perhaps we find a Kant in China, because China has such a great history. I'm sure there was somebody in China who could be rewritten in a Kantian light.
Why would they bother doing that? I would like to probe you a little bit more on this issue about transcendentalism, and transcendental, the claim to transcendental, because as a political theorist, I've been taught to be very suspicious of transcendental claims, because I come from a culture that uses those claims to justify unpleasant things. So I've become quite worried about that. And in Western political theory, we've evolved various ways of trying to generate understandings of transcendental values, which have not really gone terribly well. And my concern is that when you use your word, which I can't say, transcendental, what you assume is that there's some kind of a spectrum there, that you've got various transcendental claims that could be described as Christian or whatever. And then there's another type of transcendental claim which sounds very much to me like the moral point of view. In other words, it's impartiality, right? So you lift, it's sometimes referred to as the bird's eye view of morality. If I can find such a place upon which to stand, then I can do everything Calvin did and better. I like your neo-Calvinism, by the way, because I think your Wang Yi sounds like Calvin to me. But anyway, so my question is, I don't think that a Christian claim to a universal warrant is the same as a transcendental claim to values that in fact preclude those overblown statements about transcendental values. The moral point of view states quite clearly that Christians are wrong, right? Because it's a particular transcendental claim. And we had to work that out in the West through a process of Reformation, focusing notions of liberal tolerance around religion, very difficult word, different kinds of liberals, in order to be taught that when somebody says, I know the truth, you should probably give them some psychiatric help or something of that nature, because it's a bloody dangerous thing to do. Now you're taking me to this environment. I know nothing about this environment. I would like to ask you how central the issue of Christian liberalism is to the prospects of political reform, because I had no idea. I mean, this is news to me, and that's fine. It's interdisciplinary. Yeah, but so I'd quite like it if you could just simply mention how serious this is. What is it that grabbed you? That you want to study this as a genuine lever of change. But I don't understand how you can do that unless you can spot the problem with all universal knowledge claims, which is that they are, in fact, even Kant, situated within a particular culture, and that they are not universal knowledge claims.
Okay, there were more than one question there, I think. Maybe I should start by sort of explaining a little bit more why I study this. Because there are a number of claims. I mean, I mentioned before there's a book that came out 10 years ago now, which is called Jesus in Beijing, how Chinese Christians are transforming the global balance of power, was the subtitle. So that led to, it had a huge impact on the study of Chinese Christianity, but also on, it sort of picked up on this this nexus that started to sort of appear between political activism, rights activism in China and Christianity, in the sense that more and more of the individuals involved in it happened to be Christians. And that sort of was my original starting point, actually before that book. So I taught a class here called Democracy and Human Rights in China, and the research for that sort of seemed to throw up more and more every year, sort of these individuals that were very active, and those who were most daring and most outspoken happened to be Christians. So I sort of put this, which is why I just very simply asked the question if there's any link between Christian belief and political activism. So that was sort of my starting point, and while I was sort of engaged in these very preliminary musings, that book was published, and which I read, which in turn led to an increased, much more research and publications on Chinese Christians, and an increasingly link that was being made between lawyers, for instance, the lawyers that I mentioned here, and Christianity, certainly in human rights activist circles and human rights activist publications. And my response to that was then, especially to that book, which remains one of the most, which was extremely well researched. I mean, that wasn't just a, you know, it wasn't as a source. It was a very, very important source. The claim was a different matter, and so my the way I started on this project was really more sort of an incredulous response of, really, is that really happening? And so that's how I wanted to look at how does it really manifest itself? Where does Christianity and Christian belief actually have an impact, both socially and politically? So the book that this is just one part of it. I mean, I look at the influence of Christian values and terminology on moral discourse, on official discourse as well. So the whole discourse, the big political project or ideological project in China today is the harmonious society. And so investigating in what way Christian concepts are having an impact on this ideological discourse of the harmonious society, for instance. But also looking at whether Christians are in fact involved or can in fact be involved in charity work in China and in social service. And it also looks at, so I also look at publications, online publications, which have sometimes been framed Christian publications, some of which early ones, by early I mean early this millennium, they're very political and very, very closely associated to these lawyers, and were very, really put things on the public agenda that were simply not discussed and on the public political agenda before. So when I say, for instance, the most recent petition by 71 academics within the system, but essentially party members that ask for the proper implementation of the Chinese constitution, for instance, and that ask for the safeguarding of all sorts of rights and the proper inter-party democracy. I mean, these one has to credit a certain number of individuals for bringing these topics into the open, and for having sort of, for whatever, and you may or may not agree with their personal faith or conviction, have to be credited for having done that, and for having taken significant risk, personal risk for doing that, and who are also, most of them actually, of these very early, very small number of activists are paying quite a big price for it. They're either under house arrest, or they're in exile, or they're in prison. So it's, and at the same time, sort of at a wider level, you have these, talking about Christians in China, sort of at the grassroots, you hear a lot about so-called house churches, and how house churches are, have to meet clandestinely and are repressed by the state and persecuted, and this. And there's a very, very strong agenda here that is being pushed also by the US media and American evangelical groups, who have obviously great access to media and so forth, where sort of the received wisdom is that all Christian, the majority of Christians in China worship underground, and that all Christians are by definition in opposition to the regime and so forth. And I sort of, I also question all of that to say that, well, actually the majority of Christians are very, very regime conform. They tend to emphasize how law-abiding good citizen and what good citizens they are, and so it's very complicated, to put it in not too sophisticated terms. In terms of the transcendental, I think it needs to be, that really needs to be, I mean, I take your point, but obviously you and all the political theorists are approaching this from the point of view of of knowing all that has happened in Christianity and Christian thought, and all the things that it has done, and all the historical events. Now, Chinese Christians aren't ignorant. I mean, and they are, but it is not the same part of their intellectual heritage. This is not what is most significant for Chinese Christians. I mean, for a Chinese Catholic, child abuse is not the first thing that comes to his or her mind. Whereas I think in Western academic circles, that is pretty much probably the first thing that we tend to think about. So I think that needs to be appreciated. That although Christians, and by which I now mean sort of those who are articulate, who take part in public discussions, who publish, absolutely at pains to point out that Christianity is not a Western religion, but that it's a global religion, and that it doesn't belong to one country or one people. It is nonetheless something that is different from Chinese culture, and that in the 1990s started to be debated or presented as a possible solution for China's problems intellectually, and in terms of the concepts it entails, in terms of the values that it brings. It was and continues to be closely associated with political liberalism and democracy and the constitution. So I think it's almost inevitable, of course, that one brings all these reservations to it, but in that case, the context in which it is discussed really also needs to be appreciated, and that context also is a context of where the media often call it a sort of a moral crisis or a moral decline. I mean, they call it a moral vacuum. It's not a moral vacuum, but it's that there isn't one. There doesn't seem to be an agreement. What are the benchmarks? What is right? What is wrong? What can you do? What can you not do? Where's the different? Where does self-interest have to stop and the interest of society become larger? And so people are looking for their own. I mean, obviously under Mao, that was all politicized, and the consequences of deviating from that were also very, very serious. But there hasn't really been. There is no one all-encompassing value system. Of course, there are lots and lots of different ones now, and. So, and Christianity is a contender there. I would say that shouldn't be underestimated. But on the one hand, I definitely don't say that that's the future and they're all going to be Christians and it's going to be the democratizing force. I definitely do not say that.
30 or 2030.
30 is the vision, but in 2030, yes. And but on the other hand, one has to acknowledge that Christianity is a very serious contender, or is a very interesting or attractive and presents a credible moral system for people who live in this
we
reality.
may have to move on to our
Yes,
final
yes,
two questions,
yes.
and because I have promised refreshments. Derek and then Alexa.
Just picking up on your
We
point.
take them at once, Susan.
Right, picking up on your last point about contenders and different voices in this debate. You mentioned near the beginning of your talk that there's going to be this meeting, the New Left and various groups
Well,
are proposed. And I'm interested in the New Left critique of this liberal Christianity and other critiques coming from non-liberal perspectives. If I understood what you said correctly near the beginning of your talk, you said that the liberal Christians are arguing that more market reform is required for social equality. And this seems to be quite counter to prevailing kind of discourses globally, certainly, that we've got into a huge mess through too much market reform and loss of morals. And I think the New Left and perhaps other non-liberal critiques of that point of view would say that the state also has an important role to play and that there have been very valuable kind of movements from the Maoist period and through socialist theories promote equality amongst women and men, gender equality, and of course in practical terms that didn't play out entirely fully, but it seems a lot better than the idea of complementary gender. The notion of economic equality, social equality, very strong ideas for that the New Left would be drawing on from more or neo-Maoist perspectives and more left-wing perspectives. So this idea, how do the Christians respond, or how do the New Left and other groups critique this market radicalist view that the social equality can be generated through more market reform? I'm not sure how much purchase that would have in wider society in China, since there's so much obvious inequality caused by market reform in China.
If we could take the second question, that takes us to our first seminar in the series. Alexa, yeah.
I'm sort of again also going back to what you said at the sort of close of the last response and also earlier about Christianity being, for better or for worse, a serious contender for an effective critique of the status quo. And I was wondering if in your book you examine why Christianity in particular, because the sort of the transcendental elements, and I agree with sort of other speakers that sort of might be problematic as a benchmark of analysis, but that's sort of by the by. So Christianity shares that sort of transcendental orientation with sort of various other religions. So why Christianity in particular, and is it to do, and it's a very naive, genuinely naive question, to do with the fact that Christianity and communism are estranged cousins, but definitely very closely related, and share a lot of sort of conceptual common ground, and maybe dislike each other so intensely because of the sort of family relations. It's purely speculative, but it strikes me as odd that sort of China, this sort of far away, strange to me, a country becomes a battleground for a very, very old and tired argument.
So the market reform, I think that's I have not. I mean, the how the liberals, their view on the economy and the market is not something that I have studied in great detail at all. But certainly, it's fair to say that the Christian liberals don't talk about the economy. They have there is no great interest in sort of these particular aspects. It's much more about principles and constitution and philosophy. There's not so much. Charles Yao is an economist, and he may well have. I'm sure he has written extensively on what the market is or is not supposed to be doing in China. But I'm afraid it's not something that I have studied. The left do generally just equate Chinese liberals with American neoliberals, and sort of that's the criticism. Although then there are those voices who say, well, that's not fair because Chinese liberals generally do emphasize social inequality in the sense that it needs to be addressed, but don't necessarily agree on how that should be done, or how that should be addressed. In terms of this Christianity and why is Christianity so attractive, I think there are many different reasons why Christianity is particularly attractive, and there are different reasons for different people or different demographics. One is because it is and was certainly since the early 90s, started to be associated with the success of the West, and not just in terms of somehow managing to have, or being at the root of successful societies that are capitalist, that are economically successful, but yet do not display the excesses that and huge gaps that we can see in China today, for instance. But there are, I think, in my view, one of the main reasons is psychological. So what is hugely attractive to Chinese, those who have already converted Chinese Christians will speak primarily about love and the notion and the importance of love in Christian faith. The notion that there is that God is the source of all love, that God loves you, that that God forgives. I mean, it's sounds incredibly trite when you just talk about it here, but when you speak to individuals, it's absolutely palpable how much comfort is derived from that. And that again probably needs to be understood in the social realities of contemporary China. So this idea that there is this force out there which is outside the human realm, that to whom you can have an individual relationship. It's the individual believer can build this relationship to this to God, who is forgiving and loving, accepting. I mean, that's meant that most in the interviews, most people will cite that as one of the most important factors, which is hugely. On a psychological level, I think that's really the most interesting aspect. If you look, for instance, also at the complementary and gender roles, sitting and talking to, educated women who work in academia, who are completely married to non-Christian husbands, and so who often go to the Bible study group, or that's usually how it starts, that you get drawn into a Bible study group, and then ultimately you may or may not lead to conversion. It's just it's like the answer to all their marital problems. It's all of a sudden it's this accepting where you, as a sort of, several who have told me that they sort of headstrong, constantly fighting with their husbands when they come home, and that is associated also that it needs to be aware of Chinese male business practices and conventional behavior that is difficult to accept, often for assertive women. Often involves sexual encounters and hostesses and lots of drinking, gambling, and so forth, which is sort of part of the culture. And so somehow this finding, through studying the Bible and discovering these values and these ideas that God loves, first of all, God loves everybody, but also you are called as an individual, then you're called to love those who are not lovable. And all this turns into this soothing, it's very easy to make fun of it, but it is very, very genuine, it is baffling. But it turns into these, one said, well, now I don't quarrel anymore, I just pick up his socks, I bring in his slippers, and it's all, we don't fight with him, and it's all hunky-dory. And then, of course, that is encouraged also by the men. It's not surprising that the continued Bible study and conversion to Christianity is encouraged. So I think, personally, I think the psychological reasons are very important. But also this Christianity and communism share values, as you say. Although where they come where they come closest, that's where actually those so-called true Christians disagree, because where they come closest, where it comes to sort of love thy neighbor and act out on charity and and calling on that to be sort of putting love into action, as they call it. That's not necessarily a theology that many of the Christians subscribe to, because that's associated paradoxically with the state.
It's a selective theology,
and
a very selective version of Christianity, which would then make me question whether you can really even talk about sort of Christian values.
Well, I think there we need to be careful, because I think what we in Europe understand as Christian values is also very, very different from American Christianity, American contemporary Christianity. So I think ultimately it's a definition of what kind of Christianity it is, but it's
and that's where the sort of theological argument
yes.
is.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we try and finish at 2:15, but we've gone a bit over time. But it's been a really fascinating discussion. So I'd like to thank you first of all, and more importantly, we look forward to the book launch and the
Me too.
celebrations.